Good morning. Can you hear me? Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I hope you had a very nice evening, but also some kind of rest after the very nice evening, because we have a packed day today, which I'm really looking forward to. We're starting with a very, very interesting topic, which we started talking about yesterday, but it definitely proves to help to get the discussion going this morning. So I'm going to hand over to Jeroen, our newest board member from Oxfam International, who will be moderating the session. Over to you, Jeroen.
Thank you very much, Jean. Yes, so welcome to this session, Green Recovery, Empty Rhetoric, or Just Transition, ? I had difficulty deciding how to read that, so I decided just to include the punctuation so everyone knows that we're asking a question: is this a just transition or is it empty rhetoric? This session will be based upon the slogan, Build Back Better. It's an interesting slogan. It implies so much future promise. But the one thing it definitely agrees upon is that what we had before was not good enough and we need to build back better. We have several panelists with us, several eminent panelists with us, who will be discussing the various options that have been put forward by the multinational and regional institutions on how we can build back better towards a green and just transition. It really sounds fantastic when you say it like that, but the question that we are asking, once again, is this the real deal, or is this just empty words? With us today, we have Carla Montesi from DG INTPA, so that is the European Union's development cooperation arm. We have, unfortunately, Liddy will not be able to join us, but we also have Elena Crasta from the ITUC Just Transition Center. We have Chenai Mukumba from Tax Justice Network Africa, and we have Max Agile on the internet, who is the author of People's Green New Deal. We will first hear from Elena, and then Max, and then Carla, and then Chenai. So please, Elena.
Thanks for the invitation. Perhaps I should explain really, really quickly who we represent. The ITUC is International Trade Union Confederation. We organize about 200 million workers across 163 countries worldwide. And the Just Transition Center is a very small department of this trade union center. And what we do, we try to help our affiliates to get just transition plans for their workers. So we have very brilliant colleagues who deal both at international and European level with the policy content, with the international negotiations to get these things down on paper. And then our task is to actually bed down all of these wonderful commitments and make sure they turn into reality for workers across the world. So as I said, we try to get just transition plans for workers, and that means in most cases going down to basics and reminding everyone the origin of just transition and what it means according to International Labour Organization and the UN guidelines. And this definition puts social dialogue at its core. And, you know, it's not a new concept, it's now on the lips of everyone, but we seem to be witnessing a case of misappropriation, because we also hear employer organizations using the term just transition, but not meaning what it actually means, which is sitting down with the trade unions and negotiate company plans, you know, even when it gets to company closures, you know, what happens afterwards. And so a key point that we make at every turn is that trade unions want to be at the table and not on the menu. So and this is not just because we are self-centered and self-serving organizations, but because if workers have good conditions, their families and their communities and the economy at large benefit from it. And collective bargaining, just as a reminder, is a very straightforward way of redistributing wealth and redressing the imbalance of power. Again, I might sound very old-fashioned, but that struggle between capital and labor, still there, 21st century, but still there very much. If you want to deal with the root causes of inequality, a good starting point is guaranteeing good working conditions for those who are at work, including in the informal economy, because they're no less workers, even if they don't appear in statistics and etc. So because of this redistributional effect of collective bargaining, it is no wonder that some employers and complicit governments don't want it. And so they're very quick to forget the original definition of just transition, and they're very quick about drawing plans, coming up with measures that do not have trade unions at their core. And again, we don't make it an exclusive business. When I say trade unions, obviously we have a counterpart. We negotiate with employers. And we're not exclusive to the extent that we don't want civil society organizations anywhere near associated with these processes. But I think it's worth reminding that we have, as a representative of workers, we have a very specific role to play, and that needs to be respected. Now, having laid out this disclaimer about definitions and our role, I'll try to answer very directly the question, which is, are all of these so-called just transition plans and recovery plans actually going to deliver a just transition? Well, the very straightforward answer is they have the potential to do so. But again, on condition that the key actors are there and are empowered and enabled to protect their interests, and that things are not decided over their heads, which is, I think, is a key part of it. And I'll just give two examples to illustrate this. In Europe, the European Union has devised a recovery and resilience facility, which is a pot of funding that member states of the EU can apply to aid their post-pandemic economic recovery, the Building Back Better. And 37% of this funding has to go towards greening the economy, is one of the conditions for accessing these funds. All very well so far, except that we have witnessed, especially in Eastern Europe, where social dialogue is not really flavor of the month, that private consultants from PricewaterhouseCoopers have been drafted in to draw up the national plans on how to spend this money without trade unions. This is all about coal phase out, closing down coal mines, having to green heavy industry, which still gives a lot of jobs in these economies, and workers haven't been consulted. And so that is probably the wrong way to go about it. There are obviously good examples in Europe as well as bad, and to commend the services of the European Commission. They do remind that trade unions need to be consulted when member states have to draw up these plans to unlock the funds, but not every member state is being compliant. And so then the question is, what are the sanctions? Are the funds going to be disbursed anyway? And it's a bit of a catch-22, because obviously these communities, these workers need the funds. But we also, we don't want to waste this leverage. It's a perfect occasion to insist that trade unions need to be implicated. And the last example I wanted to draw upon is the Just Transition Energy Partnership, fund that has been agreed to aid the coal phase out in South Africa. It was agreed with a bunch of donor countries, including the EU, at the last COP. Our unions in South Africa report that so far they have been implicated in the design of this fund, but it is their very firm wish to continue to be implicated in the delivery and implementation of the fund, which is there precisely to ensure that there are good jobs at the end of this process. Now, the trade unions also put very clear conditions on the table, because if you want to deliver just transition, accessing this fund should not be on highly concessional terms. So it should not be an entry point for private corporations from the global north to go into South Africa and demand the privatization of the public utility company that provides energy to South Africa. So our unions, COSATU in South Africa, are saying that absolutely it should not come with the privatization of the public utility, because they know that privatization equals job losses and worse terms and conditions for the workers that do remain servicing the public utility. So we're very much hoping that in dialogue with trade unions in the global north and governments from the funding countries, these demands can be respected. And the last point I'd like to make is that you wouldn't be surprised to hear that trade unions in international settings have just come back from Bonn, the intersessional between COPs. The trade unions, one of the things they're demanding is more finance. There is $100 billion commitment from the last COP, and countries around the world, especially in the global north, have not lived up to that commitment. So there should be more, but again, it should be highly conditional. This finance should be highly conditional in social terms. So again, making sure that the funding is used to increase social protection and improving working conditions, and make sure that there are job plans for these economies, especially in the global south. And I think I'll end there. I hope I haven't gone too much over the 7 minutes.
Absolutely fantastic timing, as we made up a little bit in the end. So that was an exemplary example to the rest of the panelists. So thank you very much for that. As someone who As someone who lives in Belgium, which is one of the few countries which is not trying to impoverish its workforce through mandatory indexation, I'm always very grateful to the Belgian trade unions for allowing me to continue to thrive in this period of high inflation. Next, we will move to Max Agile, who's the author of People's Green New Deal. Max, please, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much to the organizers. When we think about the global economy, we can have a tendency to normalize or erase certain of its structural features. This is in fact perfectly normal, which does not mean that it is just. Rather, this normalization of blind spots is an example of something we have learned in particular about from feminist theory. Its standpoints are partial. And something else we have learned. The world looks very different when looked at from the bottom or the lower rungs of the social hierarchy rather than from the top. In particular, one aspect of the history of Europe has only, and far too late, come to the attention of European publics: a reckoning with colonialism, as in Indonesia or the Congo. And indeed, this has not yet risen to the level of discussing reparations. It is logical that if it has taken so many decades for the colonial past to even enter in a partial way into public debate, then hierarchical post-colonial aspects of the European relationship with the rest of the world may be difficult to discern, but they are no less present in structuring contemporary European economies. Now, models for the green recovery appear overwhelmingly to be based on notions, first, of a primarily internal European green transition, two, notions of an Anthropocene, that is, they do not pay attention to colonialism and capitalism as structuring responsibility for the climate crisis. Three, economic growth, thereby normalizing monopoly capitalism. And four, circular economies, in line with a now common vision of re-embedding production and distribution relations, or the economy, into non-human nature. I want to suggest, in partial and abbreviated terms, another way of considering recent European environmental economic history from the 1970s until the present, as not a phenomenon unfurling merely in Europe, of course, but rather a global process, and a global process which has distributed wealth and want, pollution, and pristine landscapes quite unevenly. At least two processes are of note within this. One, of course, is the massive European concentration to the world accumulation of carbon dioxide, far beyond the capacity of global sinks to absorb. The second is European offshoring of some of its most polluting industries. Of course, these are structural facts, not normative judgments. The first fact has been broadly recognized in a series of meetings from the Rio Summit in 1992 onwards, and crystallized in the idea of common but differentiated responsibility. The second was widely recognized in the ecological literature from the early 1970s, when these processes began. These two facts indicate that aspects of post-colonial European interaction with the formerly colonized world has retained structural unevenness with respect to the distribution of ecological damages or waste dumping. Of course, this unevenness is evident in a range of other dynamics, going from debt payments, vastly disparate per capita incomes on north-south lines, that is roughly claims to global production and to value captured in global commodity chains, which concentrate in Europe, and the under-reproduction of the peripheral ecology, which conduces to cancer, respiratory disease, and shortened lifespans in the global south of the formerly colonized world. Current recovery plans simply do not address these structural dynamics. In not addressing them, they are bound to continue them. We might see some aspects of this, for example, in plans for energy harvesting in North Africa, in World Bank IMF loan terms, which tend to prohibit counter-cyclical spending and push for privatization in the formerly colonized world, and an overall plan which reduces international reparation dynamics merely to a question of aid, to a complete silence on the distributional issues involved in the minerals needed for a European transition, which will come from a periphery whose so-called comparative advantage often remains low value-added primary export with attendant socio-ecological costs. Child mining of cobalt in the Congo, for example, when cobalt is a major mineral needed for the transition. What can be done? First, we need to discuss capital grants rather than the common discourse of aid, enfolding but not reducible to debt cancellation. The Cochabamba People's Agreement called, for example, for 6% of Northern GNP per year to flow from the OECD countries to the South. In principle, there is no reason such a distribution cannot occur. Second, technology sharing and abolition of Northern intellectual property protection for the needed clean transition technology. This tech cannot be an arena for profit when it is needed for human survival. Third, and critically, the European states need to allow the formerly colonized world to choose its own political, economic, ecological, and social path. This does not mean approbation of the internal texture of each post-colonial country. Rather, it means upholding the rights to self-determination, which were enshrined in the anti-colonial struggles for national sovereignty and liberation, which have belatedly entered the European public sphere. This does not at all exhaust the list of proposals. However, these would go some way towards making good on the debt incurred, the debt outstanding, and not the debt owed from the post-colonial world to Europe, but rather the debt which Europe has incurred to the post-colonial world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. And you have initiated a race to the top for the other panelists in terms of the timing. So very well done. And three very, very clear calls to action in terms of how we can ensure an actual just transition and not just rhetoric. I will now turn to Carla, who is the Director for the Green New Deal and Digital Agenda of INTPA, which is the development arm of the European Commission. So please, did you want to take the podium? Or, okay, fantastic. Please go ahead. You have 10 minutes.
Many thanks. I move here like this, I can look to all of you. And many thanks, and very happy to join you today. Not sure that I will succeed now with all the suggestions by Elena and Max to remain with my minutes, but let me try. Maybe let me start with a proper background. And of course, you know all this very well, but I want just to start by this. You know very well that the most recent reports from the International Panel on Climate Change basically tell us that as things stand now, global warming will exceed 1.5 centigrade during this century. This means that in the coming years, we will have more than 3 billion people high vulnerable to climate change, and that risks ranging from biodiversity loss to food security will increase severely. COVID and the current development in Ukraine, the current war in Ukraine, making all this much more complicated. And of course, currently, we are fighting the risk of inequalities, uneven recovery path, food security issue, and rising debt levels in the least developed countries. Because as always, when a crisis appears, of course, are the most developed and most vulnerable people that are first more affected by all these crises. And we know that women and girls are especially disproportionately affected by the climate change, and that they represent 8% of the people that is displaced by natural disaster and or by extreme climate events. Now, what does means green recovery? You know that we have launched, it was said at the beginning, we have launched the European Green Deal in 2019, in December 2019, and this has become our roadmap for a green inclusive recovery. We have adopted the Green Deal immediately after COVID has appeared. But I will not mention what is the Green Deal because you know it's our green economic agenda, but has to remain our way to build back better. I know that is a general word, but it's very important. Building back better for us means that we need to focus at the same time on planet and on people. These two elements has to go hand in hand. And I think Elena has already mentioned some instruments that as European Union we have put in place with the Green Deal that I don't explain you in its complexity, but we have put in place the Recovery Resilience Facility in Europe just to help to ensure that we have a just green transition. Now, despite all the crises that we are facing, COVID and now invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the Green Deal for us, for the European Union, remain high relevance. And we continue to think that it offers many of the answers that we need. As you know, we have the Green Deal for Europe, but as you know, we also translate our Green Deal ambition around the world. So I am in charge of the directorate working in the European Commission in the Directorate of International Dimension. And allow me to say that when we know that we focus the climate change, we need, of course, to tackle action in Europe, but we need to tackle action around the world. Just because Europe means just 90% of the gas emissions. So it's very, very important, the dialogue that we have to put in place around the world. And this is the reason why our Green Deal agenda is also translating our international partnership. And the financial instrument that we have put in place for our international dimension, the Global Europe, it's our tools, I would say, to support our partners around the world, to ensure, to implement, to support their path towards climate change. We have put in place Global Gateway. Global Gateway is, I would say, our external arm of the Green Deal. A Global Gateway we imply using all the different instruments that we have, from political dialogue to support, using all the different means of financial instruments that could be grants or concessional loans to promote this green and the digital transition, increasing opportunities for all. This is very important. This social element of the strategy is very well presented in the strategy. Now, what does that mean in our approach? The approach is really about an integrated response. An integrated response to our partners. Integrated response, it means for us that we want to tackle together the human and the environment dimension. So, as you know very well, for our Commissioner, Urpilainen has put the fight against inequalities as one of our priorities. This implies that with our financial instrument, with our Global Europe, we are tackling, supporting the partner countries in achieving a green transition, but also our engagement on education, health, gender equality, access to finance and employment opportunities. And our tools are used to support our partner countries under this dimension. Now, what this means in practice, this integrated answer, looking to people and looking to the economy, looking to the environment. I will just give 2 or 3 examples. For example, when we look in Africa in the next 4 years, we launch a big initiative that is called, we have called Natura Africa. We want to tackle biodiversity loss, but also at the same time improving the livelihood and empowering the local population. So we want to, the method that we use, it's what is called the landscape approach, where we tackle together with the local communities, so in strong local dialogue with the communities, both protection of biodiversity, but also job for the people around, for example, the parks. The same go for forest partnership. So facing climate change, we need to look to the forest. We are engaging with many partner countries around the world, partners that wish to work on forests, in order to create a better management of the forest, so forest management, a more sustainable supply chain, but also looking to the equality issue and to the economy of the local population that live and the indigenous people that are living around the forest. When we look to the climate change, of course, we are working with supporting our partner countries in implementing their national determined contribution to mitigation and adaptation. And as you know, just in Glasgow, we have decided to support one additional 100 million just for the Global Adaptation Funds. One key element of our green transition is also what Max already mentioned, it's our work on energy. The priority on energy will remain access to safe, sustainable, and affordable energy, because we know very well that energy, it's not just a transition to a more sustainable green energy production, but also energy is clearly the key instrument for eradicating poverty. It's essential to delivering on the 2030 agenda. It's essential to work on poverty. So, of course, when we look to energy, of course, we want to support the global energy transition, but we are working also to promote socially just economic and energy diversification plan that will provide, of course, access and affordability of energy supply in the most affected countries. Elena already mentioned one example of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, as she already mentioned that at the COP26, France, Germany, UK, and the US, together with the European Union, we have announced the work of a Just Energy Transition Partnership to support South Africa's decarbonization efforts. It's clear that it was the first case. We want to build some just energy partnership also with other countries, and we are discussing in the context of G7 with other countries. But what I want to mention, as Elena already introduced, of course, when we define this just energy transition partnership, the clear idea is to work with all the stakeholders. This is a key element on working on this just energy transition partnership. Of course, allow me to say that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one again, has a great impact on the energy market, affecting also our developing partner countries. And this is the reason why I'm quite sure you have listened about the Renew Energy and also our European Union external energy strategy that was issued just in May. Once again, the European Union has knowledge that the green energy transition is the only way that allows us to simultaneously ensure sustainable, secure, affordable energy worldwide. So, of course, we are determined at the level of Europe to diversify our energy supply. We will have to, of course, but we still engage to work with our partner countries, of course, to continue engage and to support and to enhance their climate ambition and to define a pathway with them on this climate neutrality. And of course, this implies establishing long-term relationships that are mutually beneficial. Last point, on sustainable food security, I want to mention this because, of course, with the current crisis, food security remains an important point. I'm quite sure that we can discuss together in all this. What I wanted to just ending saying, this green transition recovery remain a main objective, and of course the current big crisis, COVID, and once again the Ukraine war, should not deviate all of us to continue to work with short-term initiative, short-term investment and medium and long-term investment to this, and working all together with all the stakeholders and of course with all the local population will be an essential element in our strategy. Many thanks. Sorry if I was too long.
No, you beat me to it, so thank you. Well done. Fantastic. And now, last but not least, we have Chenai Mukumba from TJN Africa, Tax Justice Network Africa. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Is this, oh, it's on, perfect. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to this really important topic. Very quickly, my name is Chenai Mukumba. I'm the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager for Tax Justice Network Africa, which is a network of civil societies across the continent. We have about a membership of 44 different civil societies in 26 different countries, all working on this topic of tax justice, illicit financial flows, etc. And in partnership with a number of other regional institutions are a part of a consortium called Stop the Bleeding. Essentially what this consortium does is to see how we can work together to advocate for the reduction of African resources leaving the continent. So with regards to this particular topic, it's pertinent to the African context for three different reasons. First and foremost, Africa accounts for about 20% of the global population. Despite this, we only contribute about 3% of the worldwide carbon dioxide emissions. That's how much as a continent we are contributing. Having said that, as a continent, we're losing between 5 and 15% of our GDP as a result of climate change. Africa is the least climate resilient region in the world, significantly highly vulnerable as a result of its geography, but finds itself suffering some of the most significant negative impacts of climate change. It has 5 of the 10 most affected countries worldwide. A couple of months ago, some of you may have seen, in South Africa, we had a situation where in a region called KwaZulu-Natal, in one day, that particular region received more rainfall than it's ever received in an entire season. And we saw people's houses literally being washed away by this water. What was particularly significant when you took a look at the images is that you saw these African women standing and seeing their entire livelihoods gone, which also then speaks to the issue that when you're talking about who is most negatively affected by this issue, it's African women, it's women of color, women that often can't find themselves in these conversations, but are most negatively impacted by what's going on. But also when you take a look at that image, what was also particularly striking is you saw these houses being washed away, but these houses had no electricity access. These houses didn't have sufficient plumbing, which essentially when you're talking about this conversation about the energy transition, requires that we also think about them within this context. This conversation is also particularly important because when you talk about the energy transition, implicit within that phrase is that you're transitioning from one area of operation to the next. But when you take a look at the African continent, over 600 million people have no access to electricity. In countries like Zambia, for example, 80% of the rural area has never had access to electricity. So when you're talking about an energy transition, what does that look like for people who have never had access to energy? And so as a result, then find themselves having to chop firewood, having to access coal in order to be able to continue with their livelihoods. And so that's why this particular conversation is pertinent as it relates to the African continent. And so when I was reading through some of these documents that pertain to the green recovery, I think there's 2 things that struck me. The first is that, you know, when we take a look at the EU Green Deal, I think it's amazing. I think essentially we can see that Europe is on its way to develop a much more efficient, much more green, much more clean economy. But at what cost? Where are the resources that are required to create this environment going to come from? 70% of cobalt, for example, can be found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't think I need to speak to you about the political instability that exists within that country as a result of different companies, of different countries trying to access these resources. So it's important to think through as well, as we are talking about this energy transition, as we are trying to navigate to building better, to building a greener recovery, who is going to be bearing the costs of that? Unless we fundamentally shift the way we think and operate, the cost that particularly African countries, that particularly the Global South is going to have to pay is going to be detrimental to the very individuals that are supposed to be benefiting from this type of mechanism. The second thing that was particularly striking to me when I was going through these documents, the EU Green Deal as well as the grid, is the focus on the private sector leading this conversation. So you'll take a look at, for example, within the grid document, it talks about the dynamism of the private sector contributing to export growth and job creation. But for us to depend on the private sector when the private sector played such a key role in putting us where we are today is counterintuitive. The private sector is part of the reason we have the global inequality we see today, both within countries and amongst countries. The private sector is part of the reason we find ourselves now having to address this issue of climate change, the externalities that we all have to pay for. The private sector is also why we see such gross inequality in access to energy, because in some areas it just doesn't make sense to create a grid because it's not profitable. And so to then depend primarily on the private sector is in a sense, almost redundant. When I was reading through the grid document, I was excited to see, for example, that we need to find finances in order to address this issue. And so as an institution, we work on illicit financial flows, and so finding ways to seal loopholes so that countries have access to then sort of churn back into access to resources to churn back into their economies. But when you take a look at those documents, again, it's let's seal these loopholes so that we have resources to, and this is interesting, support the private sector to be able to help us create the environment we need to address these issues. And so for me, those issues are particularly important as we think through how to navigate this just transition. Having said that, I think it's particularly important for us to be having these conversations, for us to be talking about what a just transition is and what it could look like. But having said that, particularly because of the first point I made about the global north and its negligible contribution, it's important that in our efforts to achieve this green economy, it doesn't compromise global south's efforts to achieve their socio-economic objectives. It can't come at that particular cost. Secondly, it's important also to speak to that first point that we can't be operating in a way that's kicking away the ladder for global south countries to develop as we're thinking through, what are the different reforms that we need to be doing at national level. Doing so is essentially at odds with this whole idea of climate justice, right? When you're taking away the very thing that global south countries need to develop in an effort to be creating a better world, when the very countries themselves that essentially are most negatively affected are being asked to do away with some of their objectives. And then as I close, I think it's important to indicate that the brunt of the burden cannot be on the global south. It's important for us to see the global north take responsibility. It's important for us to see commitments actually play out into tangible, concrete resources to facilitate this. I think the amount, not the amount, but the development of the global north now took place on the back of the global south. And it's important to make sure that even now, as we're talking about building back better, we don't see a repetition in terms of the global south carrying the burden of this recovery that we're talking about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I am working under the basis that as we started late, we can end late. Is this correct? Fantastic, because we wouldn't want to punish the speakers due to the tardiness of the audience. Now then, moving on to the audience, we will now be collecting questions for the speakers. I think that what came out quite clearly, at least to me at least, is this notion of outsourcing negative externalities. While Europe is cleaning its own house, are we actually cleaning our house, or are we just dumping our rubbish on the neighbor's yard? I would hope it's the former rather than the latter, but perhaps a discussion on the space. So I ask the audience, just transition or just rhetoric? Marie-Jose.
Good morning, everyone. I do have a question that comes from Zoom, because we are live streaming this session. And I want to read the question for some of our speakers to respond to that. The question from Zoom comes from Shutri. Sorry if I mispronounce the name. And the question is, does the EU Green Deal mandate factor in the social and environmental externalities of mineral transition that will be crucial in the transition to a green economy? That's a question that has come from Zoom, and we do encourage our Zoom audience to ask more questions, and we do have one from the audience.
Yes, Chiara over there has a hand raised. There's many Chiaras in the audience today, actually, I just realized.
A lot of Italians and a lot of Chiara, of course. I'm Chiara Buttatura from the Oxfam EU office, and my question is also for Carla Montesi of DG INTPA. So you mentioned the Green Deal, and in the Green Deal package there is an instrument that is clearly an external dimension, that is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. For the audience, that is a mechanism that we require companies in partner countries to pay for the export to the EU. According to the to the carbon emission embedded in the exported goods. And of course, the companies that are coming from countries that have lower standards than the EU will have to pay, with no distinction for the moment of partner countries. So on one side, the EU is investing in the green transition in low-income countries. On the other side, we are asking them to pay a tariff for the carbon emission. For carbon emission that, as Chenai said, low-income countries are the least responsible, and they are also paying the highest cost in terms of damage. So as Oxfam, we have asked to exclude at least the least developed countries for this measure, but this was not on the table of the European Commission, of the Parliament, on the Member States. We are asking now to at least use the revenues of this instrument for climate finance funds, but we don't have certainty that this will pass, and the European Commission didn't include this in its proposal. So I'm asking you, what is the position of DG INTPA if you don't see an incoherence in this tool, and how do you see this proposal of exclusion of least developed countries and of use of revenues for climate finance fund? Thanks.
Thank you. We have a question in the back and then a question over here. And if that's it, then we'll turn to the panel afterwards.
Yeah, I see other Chiara in the room. We coordinated. Yes, I have a question. I think it's for Chenai, but actually for everyone who wants to reply. And it has to do with the role of the private sector in the transition. I mean, shouldn't it be one of the key agents of change towards a private transition? And if so, are we doing what we are supposed to do to make it the agents of change that we want it to be, or should we start thinking about all of this a little bit differently, or maybe not? Yeah, thanks.
And then I see Yolanda over here. Oh, Eurodad, yeah.
Encourage others.
Thank you. This is Yolanda from Eurodad, working on debt issues, and my question is precisely on that. We have a context of very high debts, public and private, but particularly public debts in the global south, and I mean, this just transition is coming with non-concessional, unfortunately, financing from very different institutions. And my question is, do you actually see it compatible? Do you think it is possible to finance this just transition that was presented together with these high levels of debt? Or do we have to solve the debt problem? Do we have to actually cancel big amounts of debt to be able, for the countries to be able to make the investments that are needed for this just transition? It's because I see an incompatibility there, not just the non-recognition of the climate and ecological debt, but the actual financial debts that exist make it very difficult for many, many countries to actually get more indebted at a very high prices, very high interest rates, in order to finance the most basic energy transition investments, not to say further investments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll take one more, but then we have to move on. Please introduce yourself, because I don't know you, so I didn't call your name.
Yeah, I'm John Sword with the Bretton Woods Project. I just wanted to pick up on what a couple of the speakers alluded to, which was the World Bank and IMF approach to the green recovery. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of that has been quite empty rhetoric, to sort of allude to the title of the current session. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of make that comment and throw it open for discussion as well, in terms of, do we need a kind of root and branch economic governance reform to achieve a just transition, actually?
The big question to end it all with. If that's okay, I will turn back to the panel now. So we had a question about outsourcing negative externalities. Is the EU taking this into account in its engagement with lower middle income countries? We have a question about CBAM, so which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's one of my favorite acronyms, CBAM. We had a question about disciplining markets. Are we giving too much carrot and not enough stick? We had a question about, is debt compatible with a just transition, or are we making the just transition too expensive for partner countries through giving them onerous terms on the finance available to them? And finally, the question of empty rhetoric. Are the institutions that exist even capable of supporting a just transition, considering their huge governance challenges? With that, I will turn to the panel, and I will begin with the online presence, if that's okay with you, Max.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the questions. And I won't address all of them because we should have a fair distribution of labor here. This question about the role of private capital, the potential role of private capital in a green transition. I think this can be addressed both at the theoretical level and also by simply examining the programmatic or the policy statements that are being envisaged by a variety of forces like World Economic Forum and so forth. But at the theoretical level, when private finance is going in, it's quite natural. It's in the nature of the relationship, which is called investment, that the private finance is going to seek maximal returns when it enters global South countries and seeks investment. So it's very natural that it would shirk both labor and ecological obligations when it comes to any form of green transition. So at the structural logic or the tendential logic of private investment for a green transition, it's something close to a contradiction in terms, which doesn't mean there may not be situations where post-colonial economies cannot harness private capital for their own needs at a certain level, but the tendency is, of course, quite against a green transition. In practice, of course, we know what the plans are. The plans are quite out there. I mean, there's work that's come out from Daniela Gabor about basically locking countries into long-term agreements that involve surrendering effective political sovereignty over their renewable investments, letting the terms be decided, letting any settlement be outsourced essentially to international tribunals and basically turning that into a sector for maximizing the extraction of profit. We know that there are plans for what they're calling the financialization of nature. In other words, the conversion of ecosystem services into first entities ostensibly legible to international capital, and then something that will then be a source of profit, that is the active human reproduction, overwhelmingly carried out by poor people in the informal economy, or sometimes even outside of the money economy in the periphery, will then be, their tasks of the reproduction of nature would then be at some level compensated. But again, the level, first, of course, there's the practical difficulties and the ecological catastrophe involved in thinking that you can actually identify and make legible these ecosystem services, right? But then there's the second, just as large issue of the fact that if you're paying somebody to carry out ecosystem services, right, and this is the capital that's coming online in order to do so, it's going to have an inbuilt structural tendency to reduce those wages to their absolute minimum, thereby recapitulating the whole problem of the both colonial extraction of super profits and post-colonial extraction of super profits and the whole offshoring enterprise to begin with. So we face what I think are insuperable structural difficulties when it comes to actually giving the driver's seat to private capital.
And then we're going to move on to Chenai, if you please. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think the question actually, Max, I think responded quite well just in terms of private sector, private capital. I think the point I was trying to make is when you are talking about a private sector led and essentially putting the private sector in the driver's seat, that's where we are at odds, because the objectives of the private sector, private capital, very different from the objectives that we say we want to achieve through this green recovery, through trying to, for example, build back better. And so, a lot of the documents that I've read speak to the way in which governments are supposed to be creating a space to facilitate private sector participation, and where we beg the question, is that particular function. I think one of the things we saw, for example, during COVID was the importance of the capable state, the importance of providing the state with the ability to operate, to lead, to have autonomy within the way the economy is functioning. And I think the extent to which we give that work to the private sector essentially will have us in a situation where the very issues we're trying to address are exacerbated. So I think that's in quick response to the question about private sector and private capital.
Thank you. Now, Carla, please.
A lot of questions.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, hope that is working. Maybe to continue on private sector, as Chenai was mentioning, she absolutely right. When you read the Green Deal, this private sector, it's appear clearly. Why it's appear clearly? Because we know, and all of you know, that just to face the climate change, to face the development path of many underdeveloped countries require billions of investments. And it's clear to all that the public funds will never be able to cope with all these billions of investment. So this is the reason why, also because the public funds are created by the citizen, once again. So in any case, there is no creation of funds. So it's very important in our view that it's a combination of intervention from public and for private. We talk about public, it's clear that when we want to use public funds also to increase all the capacity, to support the governance, to increase the capabilities of many countries, if they wish so, to support them on this human resources capability, in this institutional capacity that will lead them to do the reform and to cope with the private sector. But the private sector can, and we know private sector being European, but being also African or Asian or continental investors, of course, have the capacity to create investment that produce and create job opportunities. And this is the reason why, of course, we want facilitate the private sector. When we say facilitate the private sector, this means in our view, it's what we are doing, that we have created some in the new global Europe, we have created some new financial instrument that will, I will say, support investment from the private sector. It's not an unconditional. We want to promote investment where? In the least developed countries, where there is a high risk of investment, so private sector will never go, and also doing things that we want to do. So we have created some financial instrument to stimulate private sector intervention, to de-risk in some way the private sector intervention in some key sector that we have very well defined. And between the sector well defined, there are all the sectors that are involved with the climate change, but also there is also the education and some clearly social sector. So yes, support of the private sector, because we have to recognize that private sector can help all the public also in the job creation under some conditionalities. This is clear. On the issue of CBAM, so you are more expert than I am, but allow me to say that of course we are following all the debate of CBAM. I have to say that also we have realized a small analysis to see what will be the countries that will be really affected by the CBAM, and in fact there are not so many African countries that will be affected by the CBAM. And also when you look to this tax, we have realized, in fact, that the tax will be paid by the company. And when you look to the case, for example, of Mozambique, that will be one of the cases that will be affected by the CBAM. All the companies that are there in Mozambique are international companies. So if the tax is paid by the international company, it's fine. But of course, we are following this. We are following the impact of the regulation, and as foreseen the regulation, we be able to come back, take into account the real impact of the CBAM that was not on the basis of the study, the impact assessment that we have made, it was not so impactful for many of the less developed countries. On the debt issue, I think that there was one other question on the debt issue. Of course, European Union has not the mandate, has not, we say, the competence on working on this domain. But this is not implied that we are not following and that we are not clearly engaged in this. And if I look to some action, of course, I want just to mention that, for example, in 2020, we have engaged more than almost 200 million that we have allowed to the International Monetary Fund, trust funds, exactly for this, so exactly to help eligible countries with meeting their debt services. So it's some action where we cannot intervene alone because the debts are coming from the private sector, but clearly we are intervening with World Bank and the IMF just to alleviate the debt. But also we are working once again on the governance issue, on the capabilities, on increasing the capability with partner countries. So just to at least working with the countries on improved debt management capacity, in creating development management capacity. So we are financing some, for example, UNCTAD or once again the IMF, just to increase this capacity for the countries to work on that. One other exercise that we can do and that we support the international partner to do is also everything that is about, the transparency about the creditor, because this is also a big issue where sometimes there is absolutely no transparency. So we're pushing all the international work on all this debt. It's of course a priority, and clearly when we are facing the COVID situation or the Ukrainian situation, we are looking to the debt situation, and of course we act in the way that we not allow the country to increase the level of the debt. through concessional loans, sometimes that was appearing, but also sometimes giving grants to create a fiscal space in the budget of the government. You know that in many of the countries where working through budgetary support, and budgetary support is just a grant that will support the budget of the country in order to allow them to increase their investment without increasing the level of the debt. But it's, of course, a very complex issue. Many thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Elena, please.
Well, I'm going to sound extremely old-fashioned, and I'd say that to redress that inbuilt tendency of the private sector to maximize return on investment and profit, you need more unions to negotiate wages. It's the only counterbalance. And together with the unions, you need powerful states with a right to regulate that is not undermined by an international trading system that favors the interest of capital over the interest of people. I mean, I don't want to digress, but the fact that most trade agreements still contain private tribunals for private investors, and where workers don't have equivalent means of redress when labor rights are being violated, I think it's a scandal. And let's not forget that the World Bank, up until 2019, I don't know if they still do it, but they were publishing something called the Index of Doing Business that measure how regulations might be an obstacle. But actually, again, trade unions are a big fan of regulations, but also of the ability of the state to levy resources through progressive taxation, including at the international level. And here I nod to Jean because I'm going to mention the defunct idea of a financial transaction tax, because it's clear resources are needed. States today probably don't have infinite resources, but there are ways of levying more in a way that is fair, in a way that does not increase the debt burdens and extracts a bit of the wealth where it is created, also thanks to the contribution of workers with their labor. So I think I would summarize: more unions, more states, and more a respect for the power to and the right to regulate.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much to our panel for this wonderful discussion. I'm not sure we got down to a clear answer, whether or not this is an actual just transition or rhetoric. It seems we have a maybe with caveats, but we will be definitely trying to work towards a just transition for sure. And with that, I have to end this panel as we're a little bit over time, but thanks to the panelists for making this easy for me. And concluded.
Is this on? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeroen.